health traits are heritable. We got really similar heritabilities to other health traits such as DPR or productive life, and similar health traits to what the Zoetis would have with their clarified calf wellness traits, or some other literature now that's coming out of, for instance, Canada. Very similar heritability estimates that generally range from about 0.5 to 0.10. So essentially saying about 5 to 10% of total variation in calf traits is due to, or calf health traits is due to genetics.
Welcome back to the Dairy Podcast Show. My name is Barry Bradford from Michigan State University. Today, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Isaac Haagen to the show. Isaac, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So Isaac, you've recently joined the faculty at the University of Minnesota, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm actually coming up almost on my 1-year anniversary.
Okay, so I guess recent's a relative thing. If you're old like me, it doesn't seem, maybe seems more recent. So what's your background? Did you grow up in this part of the country, or where'd you grow up, and did you grow up on a farm?
Yeah, I actually did not grow up in the Midwest. I grew up in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
On a registered Holstein farm there. A pretty typical farm for Pennsylvania, kind of. It was a pretty small. Parents milked about 35 to 40 cows on average. Like I said, all registered, and kind of grew up in that kind of small herd registered environment.
Okay. And so you decided to go to Penn State for your undergrad work. Did you know from the beginning you wanted to be focused in dairy science, or how did that go?
Yeah, not actually really at all. I mean, I started in animal science. I knew I wanted a career working with dairy cattle.
Okay.
But I think, like a lot of folks, I thought I was going to be a veterinarian when I started. Yep. That's kind of what I knew I could be outside of being a dairy farmer.
Sure.
And then I actually have a minor in poultry science as well. And when I realized I didn't want to be a vet, I thought maybe I'd work in the poultry science world for a year or two. Had actually been offered an internship at a major poultry company. And as an undergrad, Chad Deccal asked me if I wanted to do some undergraduate research one summer. And I turned down an internship with a poultry company and did undergraduate research and kind of kept going from there.
Asepsis, an ounce of prevention. Asepsis LLC is a Wisconsin-based animal wellness company focused on the development of state-of-the-art animal hygiene technologies. Our company's mission is to apply innovative hygiene solutions into animal agricultural and veterinary applications, improving the wellness of the animals with a focus on sustainability. We accomplish this through the continued enhancement of our chlorine dioxide-based technologies within a wide range of agricultural hygiene applications, from facility and animal hygiene to water treatment.
You said you grew up in a registered farm, really interested in genetics. What was it like? At least this is me coming from my perspective. You know, when you're working in really breeding, right? You're selecting animals for mating decisions, and then for me, at least, it took a long time to understand what it is that geneticists do. Right? It's a lot of numbers, a lot of data crunching. How was that for you when you got involved in that kind of research?
It was a lot of fun. For me, I think I've always liked numbers. And so it was, for me, that was an exciting part of it, was being able to delve into data. And I think a lot of the work that I've done too has been using on-farm data. And so to me, that's really exciting, because then I get to look at PC Dart and Dairy Comp and all these records and kind of try to join them all together to get something out of it.
Okay. That's pretty cool. So you worked with Dr. Chow, and you kept going with working with him through your PhD, is that correct?
Yes. So then I finished my bachelor's degree at Penn State, and then went straight into my PhD with Chad Deccal at Penn State.
And how did you ended up focusing on calf traits, is that correct? How did that evolve?
Yeah, so it was that really, I think, kind of started more of my second year of grad school. Essentially, like so many things in the research realm, it's where's the money coming from? And Dr. Deccal had just gotten a USDA grant looking at health in organic dairy cattle systems, and I kind of was just really interested more on the calf side, and so took over the calf side of that project.
Okay, so what were the main questions you were asking?
When I was doing this project up to that point, really the only things, or most of the work in health had primarily been focused on cows. There was some calf wellness traits from Zoetis out, but really we were also looking at it from an organic perspective. So this was funded looking in organic systems and really trying to understand how kind of our one question was also how do our national evaluations impact organic producers and their selection goals.
Okay, so the basic question is, what is it about the genetics of the calves that make them more or less susceptible to common diseases? Was that the main point?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is just understanding, is there a genetic component to these traits?
Okay.
So, as a geneticist, we talk a lot about heritabilities and really we want to know, is a trait heritable? And so really, does this have a genetic component that can be passed from one generation to the next? And we look at that as a percent of total variation, which is essentially what heritability is. So we were just really mainly focused on trying to estimate what those potentially could be, and then trying to estimate what are some correlations with national traits. So for instance, our national evaluations in the US are done by the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding.
Yep.
Currently, there are if heifer livability and heifer conception rate would probably constitute the two traits that are the most geared towards youngstock. So we don't really have national health evaluations for youngstock available. So part of that is looking at what are the correlations with kind of current traits and seeing how our current selection might impact health in calves from a genetic perspective, if we're improving them genetically here.
Yep. So talk me through how you went about evaluating that. Like, how many farms did you work with, and what does it actually look like to test that question?
Yeah, so for this work, we were working directly with herds. So we had roughly 15 herds, I'll say, 10 to 15 herds that were providing data and that we were collaborating with. These herds were from across the United States. So we had herds in New England, we had herds in the Midwest, and we had herds all the way out to California. So really a cross-section of the United States. Like I said, these herds were all organic. And also really they differed, even though they were organic, we had a lot of differences in terms of management. So we had some small, maybe 30, 40 cow primarily grazing, up to operations with several thousand animals that, we're still following organic guidelines in terms of grazing, but still as a percentage of grazing time might have been less than 100% grass-fed herd.
Right, yeah.
And so we utilized those farms and we worked really closely with them and to get health data. As I said, I was focused on the calf side, so we were really looking at records that were coming from herd management software, so primarily PC-Dart and Dairy Comp. We did have some DHI Plus as well in that data set. And then some paper records as well, as some farms were just recording things on paper.
You were working with these herds, and so in that process, you were able to try to standardize reporting and definitions. Is that one of your strategies?
So we did not work with the herds to standardize what they were. We asked them to record data, but we weren't telling them they had to record it a specific way. We kind of wanted them to record it as they normally would. So that brings up, one of the challenges of any type of that health data in particular on farms is standardization, and how do you get that data and out, and that was definitely a lot of what I did during my graduate work, was just standardizing the records out of these farms. When you start talking about paper records, electronic recording, some herds, there's different event names. Some herds don't even require, don't even record an event. They might just record the actual treatment that they did to the animal. It might be recorded as an event, or it might be recorded as a description.
Yep.
And it's kind of interesting. You can go on to, I remember looking at records because, like I said, I can get really into records, and I was looking at a cow card for a calf, and the calf had like 3 or 4 different respiratory events, and they were all recorded differently, even for one calf.
Wow.
And so there's a lot of standardization that goes into that, and so that was mainly my role, was standardizing what was coming out of those herds.
Okay. So then you get data on several thousand calves, and you've got a subset of them, of course, that show some type of disease event. So then how do you actually tie that to the genetics then? Is it a classical, or are you using a genomics-based approach?
So we did have some genomic information on some animals. It was a pretty limited data set that had genomics. So the majority of our data would have just been traditional pedigree analysis.
Okay.
So we're utilizing the same records that the herd management software, and pulling out sire and dams and constructing our pedigrees from that.
Okay. So what were the main takeaways from those projects that you ran?
Yeah, I think, one is health traits are heritable. We got really similar heritabilities to other health traits such as DPR or productive life, and similar health traits to what the zoetists would have with their clarified calf wellness traits, or some other literature now that's coming out of, for instance, Canada. Very similar heritability estimates that generally range from about 0.5 to 0.10. So essentially saying about 5 to 10% of total variation in calf traits is due to, or calf health traits is due to genetics. Of course, that's a small number, but we know from other health traits that even that smaller number can have an impact over many generations. But one of the interesting things is that we did look at some genetic correlations then with national traits. So for instance, let's talk about stayability, which was just for us a measure of whether or not an animal remained in the herd at 1 year of age or did not remain in the herd at 1 year of age. And from our perspective, we were really interested in stayability over, say, mortality, because in an organic system, if an animal needs to be treated with antibiotics, it has to be removed from the organic production system. So you have animals that in a conventional setting might have been able to remain in the herd, but in an organic system are essentially involuntarily removed. And so we looked at primarily stayability, and if we start looking at that with other measures of longevity, such as heifer livability or cow livability, those correlations were kind of lowly moderate, I'll say, kind of in that 0.2 to 0.3 range, which is great that they're positive, because it means that we're, if we select for heifer livability and we select for cow livability, which are in our national selection goals, we should make progress for those in the organic system. But I think it also really highlights that there are some gaps, and that there are some opportunities for, especially maybe some of a more niche market like organic, which is, I say niche, but still has quite a large presence, and is important to a specific group of consumers. There's still opportunities to improve those evaluations, and particularly for calf traits.
Okay. So in a context where, whether a farm is organic or conventional, in a context where you are trying to make progress in many traits simultaneously, do you think there is an argument to be made for a calf health specific, 1 or 2 traits there that would go into an index, or how do you envision that developing over time?
Yeah, I mean, that would definitely be the route to go. Once these evaluations are potentially developed, they would need to be incorporated into some sort of selection index. Because really, when we talk about what we're selecting for with animals, we're really trying to say we're selecting for profit. we don't want to select for a single trait, so we have to consider them all kind of based off of their economic value.
Right. And have you tried to do any sort of back of the napkin type analysis of, you see a lot of variation across herds in terms of graduation rate from a heifer development program. Have you tried to put this on a even footing with sort of mature animal traits in terms of relative financial impact?
We've not really done that. There would clearly be some role for that, particularly, considering that heifer replacements generally are the second or third largest expense on farms. So we've not looked at what it would be in an economic index, I should say. I will say one of the things that we did, though, with this project was actually, so most health traits are recorded when we, disease traits, I should say, are recorded as a binary trait for genetic evaluations. So, for instance, an animal that gets treated once for respiratory disease would be essentially treated the same as an animal that's treated multiple times for respiratory disease.
Yep.
And that is, a limitation to these evaluations. And one of the things we did actually do was try to do an evaluation on health costs rather than a binary disease trait.
Oh, okay.
So looking at what was the, doing a genetic evaluation on what was the cost of treatment during, in our case, the heifer period. We also did this with the cow period. I'm focused primarily on the heifer period. And these results were actually published this year in JDS Communications. But really, we didn't, interestingly, in terms of the amount of variation on the calf side in particular, we really didn't notice an increase in picking up more genetic variation. So our heritability estimates stayed about the same between looking at it as a binary trait and looking at it as a health cost trait. Now, that differs from some other results that have been published. So from the University of Minnesota, where I'm currently at, they've also done some evaluations on looking at total health costs, but they've primarily focused on lactating cows. And so I think there are some differences there too, just in terms of the number of diseases that lactating cows are treated for, and just general cost of those diseases. They tended to get a little bit wider of a range of costs than we did in calves.
Gotcha. I realize it's super hard to get at this, but I also wonder, in terms of the financial impacts of these diseases, if there was a way on a large scale to track the negative productivity outcomes of, say, having an early life respiratory event, which there's some decent data on now, but to be able to track that on a genetic scale, I think would be difficult. But to me, that would probably raise the financial importance of those diseases if we could accurately quantify that.
Yeah, well, actually, one of the more interesting projects that I had during my PhD was looking at serum total protein as a health measure. And I think that actually is perhaps a little bit more interesting even than the disease traits, because one, it's a much more standardized definition.
Yep.
It doesn't require people to diagnose a disease and then record that information down. It's they still need to record what the serum total protein is, but it's pretty cheaply measured on a lot of calves using a refractometer on farm. And so we actually had some farms that were recording that in dairy comp. And that was we just stumbled upon that. That was not an original objective of this project. And we just thought it would be cool to analyze that data, and found that serum total protein is also a heritable trait for the calf. So their calves differ in their ability to essentially transfer a passive immunity beyond just dam and colostrum that was provided. So there is some individual animal variation in that as well. And one of the interesting things with that is that we did actually split animals based on a breeding value for that then into quartiles, and looked at what percent of those animals remained in the herd at a year of age on our organic operations. And we found about a 4 to 6% difference between the breeding value, so essentially their genetic level for that. So if you start calculating that over a lot of animals, that does provide some economic benefit to selecting for, just an animal's genetic ability at a young age, kind of predicting whether or not they'll remain in the herd.
Yeah, nice. You also did some work on breed differences, is that correct?
Yeah. So looking at some breed differences, that was mainly looking at Holsteins, Montbilliards, and then F1 crosses of those. So we actually were able to find some what we would consider purebred Montbilliards in the United States. And that would generally have been essentially 87% Montbilliard. So about 3 generations of Montbilliard sires. And we're able to make some comparisons and kind of get some heterosis estimates. So it was a really unique data set, actually, considering that we were able to find some Montbilliard animals in the United States to actually make, within herds that had Holsteins and F1s, to make some direct comparisons between those animals.
And what was your focus of your research there? Was it on calf health traits or other?
No, that was not calf health traits. Due partially, there weren't a ton of purebred Montbilliards in the United States, so our sample size was kind of lower. So you have to focus on slightly different traits than health traits, which require large sample sizes.
Sure.
So we were interested in some lactating performance information, so just getting actual estimates of heterosis for milk, fat, and protein. We had some body traits as well, so stature and body condition score. And then actually we were also looking somewhat at telomere lengths. So telomeres are kind of a repetitive sequence at the end of chromosomes that kind of help with integrity of the chromosomes. And but they've been kind of suggested to have an impact on, or a predictive ability on, kind of resiliency of animals and people. And so we were looking at some of those, and and just trying to get out what if there were breed differences. And there were some breed differences that we found. In general, there really weren't a lot of differences between the F1 crosses and the Holsteins for production traits. That's not shocking. That's been shown before. But because we were able to get estimates of purebred Montbilliards, we could actually estimate what heterosis effects we would expect in the United States. And the Montbilliards did produce less yield than did the Holsteins, unsurprisingly. But then when because there was no difference between the Holsteins and the F1 crosses, we were able to get some heterosis estimates of pretty typical for production traits, maybe about that 5% range.
Okay.
And that all that's saying is that the F1s performed about 5% better than we would have expected than if we had just looked at the average of Holsteins and purebred Montbilliards.
Right. Makes sense.
And then in terms of body conformation traits, we also got some heterosis estimates in there. So our F1 crosses and our purebred Montbilliards were about an inch shorter than our Holsteins, and carried, I'd say, about a 1/2 to 3/4 of a body condition more in scoring.
Okay.
In body condition scores. So
my understanding is that classically heterosis is more beneficial for traits like disease resilience and reproduction. Did you have enough data to look at those kind of questions in this data set?
In this data set, no.
Okay.
And that was part of the reason for looking at, for instance, body condition score, and some other things like that, just in terms of seeing that heterosis effect there might help explain some of the heterosis effects we're seeing in some other fitness traits.
Fascinating work. So now you're at University of Minnesota. What's your responsibilities there? You've got a research appointment, I think. What else are you focused on?
Yeah, so I've got an extension and research appointment actually.
Okay.
And so been focusing in this time in the last year a lot on still on calves, but trying to kind of lay some groundwork for creating some longitudinal data sets with calf and cow performance data, so that we can really start answering maybe some of those kind of lifetime questions and start looking at some lifetime correlations genetically between calf and cow traits. So we've got, at this point in time, we've got about 20 years worth of calf data. So about, say about 6,000 calves from commercial farms, and then working right now on essentially compiling all that cow data to merge back with the calf data.
Nice. Well, that would end up being one of the bigger data sets to monitor across, right?
Yeah, and I think will be perhaps one of the few data sets that would have lifetime performance on a lot of animals.
Yeah.
Lifetime performance.
Fantastic. What about on the extension side? What are you focusing on right now?
Yeah, so I mean, in the first year, a lot of it has been focused on just kind of getting to know the state and region a lot, and getting to know the producers in the state. Having not grown up in the Midwest, that's just getting out there and getting to know what the needs of producers are has been kind of one of the main focuses. And then also a little bit of my extension responsibility is youth. And so been working a little bit in that as well, and got to help with some of the dairy judging and quiz bowl contests that are held throughout Minnesota.
Good for you. Well, I'm sure you'll be busy. There'll be no shortage of things to do.
It's time for our famous three. Our Yeast 40 is a natural biotechnology from ICC designed to boost the health and productivity of animals under challenging production systems. Our Yeast 40 performance is supported by an unique processing technology that results in a pure product containing high levels of beta-glucans, MOS, and yeast metabolites. These factors, combined, promote the ruminal and intestinal modulation, helping the animals to reach their full potential.
All right, Isaac, we've got a few questions that we throw at everybody. First of all, what's your favorite dairy-related book or resource?
I think probably, the resource that I use the most is the Journal of Dairy Science. I don't think that's probably shocking to most people that are in dairy, that do research with dairy cattle. But so I'll stick with the Journal of Dairy Science. That's, in terms of kind of my work, that's one of the resources I use the most.
Sounds good. What about your favorite book or resource outside of ag?
I'm going to go with the resource component of that. Outside of work, kind of one of my main hobbies is cooking, and I can read a cookbook cover to cover. And I think one of the best resources that I found is a cookbook called Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, which is actually a Netflix show too, but I have not watched the Netflix show. But it's a really great resource in kind of learning how to balance kind of those four elements of cooking. So how do you balance acid and heat? How do you balance acid and fat? What's the role of salt in cooking? And it's a really fascinating book to read.
Wow. What's your go-to, like if you have a dish you're going to make to impress somebody, what is it right now?
Actually, it depends a little bit. I've kind of changed some of the things that I do as I cook, as I've gotten a little bit older and gone to less worrying about impressing people. But one of my favorite recipes to make when people come over actually is out of that book, and they call it conveyor chicken.
Okay.
And it's just taking some legs, chicken thighs or legs, and keeping the skin on, and then you're doing it on top of a stove, for instance, in a cast iron skillet, but then you put another cast iron skillet on top of that, to weight it down, and you get really crispy skin that way.
I like that. I'm gonna have to try that. Okay. Sorry, I had to get into that one a little more. I was interested. All right. So lastly, in your opinion, what sets successful dairy professionals apart from those who are less successful?
I think one of the big things is, and I think that our dairy industry actually does a really good job of this in general, is recognizing the importance to our broader audience and our global kind of community. So I think really having an eye on kind of what's the end goal of some of the things we're doing. And so whether I think about this a lot as a geneticist, because one of the cool things about being a geneticist is that if we make a change, we're generally making that change across the entire industry. And it doesn't matter if it's a 30 cow dairy or a 10,000 cow dairy, they're most likely using artificial insemination. And so I just think that that's one of the things that I think that makes a big difference is recognizing that we're trying to improve the overall dairy industry by providing a better product to consumers. And I think that having that end goal in mind and working towards that overall betterment is one of the things that really sets kind of some good dairy professionals apart.
Yeah, I get it. Being mission oriented, it makes it easier at the end of a really hard day to know that, at least to have in the back of your mind, that what you're doing is important, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Isaac Haagen, thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't met Isaac and you're in Minnesota, he's out looking to meet you in the next couple of years. Thanks for being on the show. And thanks for joining us, all those out there listening. If you haven't subscribed already, please hit that like button or follow button so you don't miss the next episode, and we'll see you then.